thank you very much indeed for your patience and all of your excellent contributions during the course of today. I know I've taken a lot away from the discussions, and I hope that you all will have as well. So I can't think of anyone better placed to conclude some of the discussions that we've been having today about the relationship between the historical study of war and contemporary conflict than our final speaker. Professor Sir Hugh Strachan is not only a prolific historian, but he's used that study of the past to inform a series of important contributions about the nature of strategy and about contemporary strategy. He obviously has too many accolades for me to list today, but perhaps some of the most relevant to the topic of our discussions are his tenure as the Chichely Chair in the History of War at Oxford, his knighthood for services to the MOD, and also his award last year of the Pritzker Lifetime Achievement in Military Writing Award. Is that the correct form of words for it?
It's such a complicated title. I can't even say it. I'm having to say it when you were all kindly saying outside, because I was having to record about the new winner, which I can't reveal to you. Well, but you will all approve.
Well, however, please all join me in welcoming Sir Hugh Strachan.
Dave knows this already. He's heard me give this talk. And I owe an apology to Laurie, who's heard me give it too, and Amy and Chris and one or two others. But tough. And one of the reasons it's tough is, first of all, that Johnny Fennell told me what Finch was going to speak about at the beginning, and this seemed to me, in some ways, to pick up the themes that Mike had been talking about, and partly because it seemed to me anyway that what I wanted to talk about was at least relevant to what you have been talking about today, and rather than go off on another tangent, that was more appropriate. And what I really want to talk about is what does strategic studies get from military history? And in some ways, this chap here, of course, is the role model, Michael Howard, and that, for many of us, certainly many of us of a certain generation, was what we were brought up to believe we should be doing. I need to remind you that despite the fact that kings think they own Michael, he was, of course, educated at Oxford. He did spend half his career at Oxford. Indeed, he decided to leave King's to go back to Oxford. I should say at this moment, I say that with some pain, because very shortly after I arrived at Oxford, I suggested to the fundraisers, because I was anxious to get more posts for the study of war at Oxford, I said we could actually use Michael Howard's name as a way of raising money. And they said, we'll get back to you. Unsurprisingly, however many years later, 15 years later, as is the way in Oxford, I'm still waiting for the reply. Their concern was whether they could name anything after a living human being, and not a problem, I'm delighted to say, that King's has had. The point about Michael's legacy is that it revivified, certainly within an Oxford context, what I think many people would see, and I know Paul Ramsey, who was working on Spencer Wilkinson, would see, as the legacy of what the study of war was meant to be when Oxford first engaged with it, something Mike talked about first thing this morning, which was the notion that he, Spencer Wilkinson, was to engage with military history precisely because military history was the way to understand modern war. And indeed, one of the sources for Wilkinson's frustration in 1914-18 was that he had a lot he felt he could contribute to the making of British strategy, and yet nobody was really prepared to talk to him about that. There were one or two generals. Willie Robertson did actually have engagement with him, and Milner, at the very end when he was Secretary of War, also had Secretary of State for War had engagement with him, but broadly speaking, he felt he had been neglected. Michael Howard brought back to Oxford some elements of that link, admittedly a very short tenure in the chair of the history of war and a longer tenure as Regius Professor of Modern History. And Bob O'Neill, when he succeeded Michael in the chair, self-evidently came, despite having done a military history doctorate, came from a strategic studies background from IISS. And indeed, if I could just be
personal anecdotal for a moment. When I arrived for my interview in 2001 at Oxford, and I was asked what I would do with the chair if I were given it, I responded by saying I'd put the weight firmly back onto military history, because it seemed to me that strategic studies was pretty well embedded in Oxford, but military history was languishing. And I said also that I thought the two fields had now grown so great in their own rights individually that actually it was impossible for one chair to encompass them both, that there might well need to be a dialogue between them, but that actually we each individually had to decide which we could do properly. Since 1909, though Oxford didn't seem to have noticed, there have been 2 world wars and the Cold War, and the consequence was that whereas Wilkinson had been worrying about Napoleon and latterly the war in Piedmont in the 18th century, there were now other things that you would have to incorporate within the syllabus. Again, this is a hard message to get across in Oxford, but I'm sure Erica, is Erica still here, will say things have got a bit better. So, how does strategic studies use history? And I think this has become an important topic at exactly that point which Mike identified this morning, which is after the Second World War. The Second World War, particularly in the Anglo-American world, and especially in the United States, I suppose, made academic communities realise that they were going to have to take the study of war a bit more seriously. And the person I'm going to use as a vehicle for this, and I know it's a familiar tale, is Brodie, whom Mike also referred to in part. In 1945, as the war was ending, Brodie was 35, a young scholar, and employed at Yale. He had completed a doctorate, which remains a pretty good standard text on the subject, Sea Power in the Machine Age, published in 1941. And the following year, in 1942, he published a brief guide to the subject, A Layman's Guide to Naval Strategy. The introduction to that book, A Layman's Guide to Naval Strategy, has a wonderfully combative introduction, and I think many of you will recognise the sorts of things it says. He wrote, "We are being told on every hand," remember this is just, the United States has just entered the war, "we are being told on every hand that we must repudiate all the ideas of the past and develop a whole new strategy overnight. But what is required is an attitude of fine discrimination and adjustment, not nihilism. The war of today is being fought with new weapons, but so was the war of yesterday and the day before. Drastic change in weapons has been so persistent in the last 100 years that the presence of that factor might be considered one of the constants of strategy. Only those to whom the study of war is novel permit themselves to be swept away by novel elements in the present war." So the layman's idea, a guide to naval strategy, then goes back to Mahan, Corbett, Castex, all the familiar people. The underlying value of whose teachings, Brodie said, is still largely intact. And of course that, going back to Mike's talk this morning, was in many ways exactly what Edward Mead Earl was doing with the Mains of Modern Strategy. It ends rather unsatisfactorily, I have to say, this discussion of Hitler and so on. It gets less good, that volume, as it gets closer to the present. But it sets Hitler, Ludendorff, and so on in a continuum that goes back to Machiavelli. It is using the past in order the better to understand the present. Now, as many of you know perfectly well, this Brodie story is not entirely from there till his demise in 1976, or whenever he did die, roughly. Laurie will tell me when he died, I'm sure. What happened, he tells us, Brodie tells us, is that on the 7th of August 1945, he and his wife are driving along the road, and like St. Paul, there's a Damascus moment when you're on the road, and in this case, I'm not being blasphemous, this particular moment, of course, he stops to buy a copy of the New York Times, and that tells him that the first of the atomic bombs has been dropped on Hiroshima. He then tells us he got back into the car I suppose he read the newspaper in the car, but anyway, he turned to his wife and said, "Everything I have ever written is obsolete." And that self-evidently isn't true. If you like to look at what Brodie then wrote later in his career, he's got War and Politics, his guide to Clausewitz is on war, published in the Michael Howard and Peter Foray translation, which far too many students of mine read in preference to reading Clausewitz. I'll come back to that point too if I get time at the end. But there was an immediate output because in 1946 the absolute weapon, atomic peace and world order, came out as a result of Brodie's Damascene moment, and in the foreword to that, Brodie said, "Thus far, the chief purpose of our military establishment has been to win wars. From now on, its chief purpose must be to avert them." And for most students of strategy, it is the absolute weapon, that book, which is the better marker to the dawning of strategic studies as an academic subject than is Edward Liddell's Makers of Modern Strategy. It seems to me, I'll come back perhaps to justify that point in a minute, and might want to come back to me and argue about that with me. It would be patently absurd to say that just because Brodie especially had realized that something very significant had happened to strategy with the dropping of the atomic bombs, that the past was completely thrown out of the analysis of strategy itself. To give a case in point with another King's connection, Basil Littlehart, when the two bombs were dropped on Japan, was working on a book which was already called The Revolution in Warfare. As a result of the dropping of the two atomic bombs, Littlehart did not jettison his conclusions, which he had already written, and which began by stating that the future is moulded by the past. He averred that the best promise for the future lies in understanding and applying the lessons of the past. What he did was he added an epilogue to the book after he had completed it, which dealt with the issue of the atomic bomb. But it did not lead him to withdraw his statement. It did not lead him to have a Damascene moment as it had with Brodie, and instead he used that to reassert the need to understand and apply the principles that would limit war, precisely because the need to limit war had become more urgent. In other words, whereas for Brodie, dropping the bombs was about avoiding war full stop, for Littlehart, it was recognizing, it's the need to recognize that war wouldn't continue, but we might have to rethink how we do it. Now, both those currents, of course, developed in strategic thought in the next decade after 1945. The current that said that that will become, if you like, the arguments about deterrence, that there was the need to prevent war, and the argument that said there was a need to contain war when it happened, and of course, and to constrain war. And of course, in a way, there is no direct contradiction between those two things. But there was still that sense that 1945 was a key departure point. And my point that is relevant today is that sense that it was a departure point. I used to have to give a lecture when I taught at Sandhurst, however many years ago that is, but several decades ago. I used to have to give a lecture called The Revolution in Strategy. No question mark on the end. The Revolution in Strategy was about the nuclear weapon. It was about nuclear deterrence and its impact on strategic thought. Now, of course, 1945 looks slightly less revolutionary the more distance we get from that particular moment. The point is that strategy was presented with a disciplinary crisis. The presumption that everything had changed, if it were true, meant that perhaps history no longer had a role, that history no longer had a part, and that other disciplines might be more important. Brodie's own supervisor at Chicago, even though he was working on sea power and the machine age, was a man called Jacob Viner, who was an economist. We now mourn the death of Thomas Schelling, died last year, one of the most influential thinkers about strategy in the nuclear age, and a man who began, above all, in the area of economics also, and was concerned with game theory and mathematics. In other words, the study of strategy, in many respects, moved from being heavily experiential, meaning based on experience rather than on scientific experiment, to being heavily theoretical. From having looked overwhelmingly to the past for its inspiration, the study of strategy turned disproportionately to the future. Now, I'm not being critical about those developments at all, but my point essentially is the challenge for strategy too was that history became the baby thrown out with the bathwater. And that is particularly problematic, I think, for us today in ways that I want to make clear. First of all, how has strategy been taught in the past? How has strategy been developed? Strategic thought up till 1945 had largely sought continuities. It was primarily a dialogue between the present, how do you do war now, and the past. And that, of course, is precisely what Spencer Wilkinson and others had been concerned with, and Edward Miguel for that matter. It gave context to current conflicts by setting them against those that had gone before. And it assumed that war had a universal nature, even if it changed its character, to pick up a Clausewitzian theme, and it also had a value in that what it recognized, and this is also a Clausewitzian point, was that every soldier, sailor, and airman, to put it into contemporary context, might have an individual and personal experience of war, an experience, we've heard plenty about it today, which might be extraordinarily intense and life-changing, but which actually that individual would need to put into context in order to be able to derive utilitarian benefit from. That there is a natural tendency, I would imagine, I have never had the experience, so I can't claim this at all, a natural experience from the consequence from the intensity of military service, service in wartime, to privilege that. And then, of course, when you try to generalize from that individual experience, you need to return to the historical experiences of others in order to be able to give them shape and context. That was exactly how Jomini and Clausewitz had approached the topic when they were dealing with it in the age of Napoleon. They referred back to the 7 Years' War in order to try to understand what was distinct and different and what was similar and what was new. It was exactly what Mahan and Corbett did with naval warfare. They looked back to the 18th century as a departure point. And it's striking to me as a First World War historian how in many respects the First World War, for all its dramatic difference from earlier wars, didn't change that general tenor. If you look at Douai's works on air power, or command of the air quite specifically, the first of the books published in 1921, he says, you know, everything we know about war is exactly like Brodie. Everything we know about war is no longer relevant. So throw it all out. This is something new because we have air power, it's all going to change. And then he refers back to the First World War the whole time in order to make his points. In other words, he needs the First World War the better to understand the phenomenon that he is addressing. And that is true of a whole raft of interwar thinkers. I mentioned Liberal Heart already. Fuller certainly comes in that category. In the Soviet Union, Triantafilov, Strachan, they're doing exactly the same thing. They're using their First World War experiences as a departure point, the better to argue constructively and coherently about what is happening in the present and how that might affect the future. Now, none of that is to say that the notion that there might be some element of continuity in strategy was not challenged before 1945. Self-evidently it was, and the naval example provides clear illustrations of that. The reason that Mahan and Corbett, it seems to me, had so much impact at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries when they're talking about maritime strategy is that what they're doing is taking on a materialist school in naval thought. The natural tendency with the advent of the steamship, with the arrival of industrialization to naval warfare, had been to privilege the impact of new technology in terms of where warfare was going. And the point from the mid-19th century, from the 1850s onwards, and it applies to land warfare too, is that the technological innovation is constantly presenting warfare with change from the bottom up. And so anybody who was arguing about continuity, at least in the understanding of strategy, has to deal with this challenge coming from below, which is potentially going to have strategic effects. And in some ways, you can understand Brodie's response in 1945 as the culmination of this. Much of the change that you're talking about in the 19th century reflects the effect of technological change on tactics. What happens in 1945 is that Brodie says this actually affects strategy. The nuclear weapon means that we have to upgrade our understanding of where technology can change and undermine warfare. After 1945, new technology seemed to be in the dominant position in terms of how a strategy would be understood. And history was relegated for three reasons. There seem to be three reasons, I was saying, in particular. The first, or three ways in which this happened, that history became relegated. The first is the tendency, of course, to see, understandably, that strategy is future-oriented. Strategy in the past, before 1945, may have been based on history. It may have been located in the present, but self-evidently, strategy, if it has a shape, is designed to affect how you behave and what you do in the future. But what tended to happen after 1945 went further than that, because, and it's most extreme, and Laurie especially might sound caricaturing it, but in its most extreme form, there will be a tendency to pitch yourself 3 or 4 decades out into the future and then reverse engineer back to the present in order to explain where things might be going, instead of beginning with the present and working forward to the future. And much of this became a form, if you like, of counterfactual history. To put it in historian vocabulary, this is Neil Ferguson applied to strategy. That Neil Ferguson might argue, oh God, we're being recorded, aren't we? Sorry. He always says to me, I saw you, I didn't think he spent his time doing this, but I saw you criticising me again. Neil Ferguson will take the example of saying, well, if we'd avoided the First World War, if Britain had gone into the First World War, we'd had the European Union much sooner and on more benign terms, even more benign terms than we have it today, and we'd have got there without the Second World War. I mean, I know I'm simplifying the argument, but the way in which this argument goes. To which my response would be, well, if Britain had entered the war in August 1914, and then France had been overrun very quickly, Britain might have ended the war later in the year of 1914 on far less good terms than it did in August 1914, or it might have ended the war in 1915, even on even worse terms. In other words, once you remove one part of the building block, then you've got to start moving all the other building blocks around too. Richard Evans has made similar points where he's taken on the virtual history argument. My point about this in relation to how strategic thought develops when it's technologically driven is the tendency, when you position yourself at some point in the future, to focus on one particular weapon system. For example, to say, this is going to change everything. And if you, at the moment, of course, it tends to be unmanned and robotic systems, or it tends to be the influence of cyber, but you position yourself much further into the future and you reverse engineer back to the current situation. You show how this one weapon system is going to change and formulate the way in which we fight war at some future point, and then dismiss in the process all the other possibilities that might work to undermine that effectiveness, and to dismiss contingency and indeed political context as you do so. The second reason and we've had some reference to this already, the second reason that history got written out of the argument to do with strategic studies was the growth of departments of politics and of, in particular, political science as a result of that. Put it in the Oxford context. Before 1914, when Spencer Wilkinson was applying his trade at Oxford, modern history was actually the course chosen by those aspiring politicians at Bailey. That's what they did. And indeed, it was the most successful of all Oxford schools before 1914. After the First World War, totally understandably, just as Aberystwyth and elsewhere embraced international relations, Oxford starts developing politics courses. And PPE very quickly becomes, as it is today, the course of choice for those aspiring to political careers. Early days PPE, indeed even when I first arrived at Oxford, the lectures I used to give in 20th century international history were designed for historians and for those doing politics. That unity has very largely, certainly by the time I left in 2015, had collapsed. That relationship between international history as understood by historians and international history as taught to students of politics had gone. And indeed, one of the most striking things, I think, for many of us who engage with politics students, and I do it full time now at St Andrews, is how little history they know, even very recent history. And that is, of course, in part for another reason, which is that theory becomes the departure point, and history is used as the case study to illustrate the theory. Indeed, the presumption, very largely derived from the American Academy, is that you must have your theory clear first before you start doing your case studies. So the issue of contingency, the experiential side, has been entirely written out of that. Moreover, of course, what also happens is that the history that is used bears no relationship to the history that those of you who are historians will use. To give you two examples, both derived from the First World War, most historians have now moved on from Fitzfisher when they talk about the origins of the First World War. Surprisingly few international relations theorists have. They are still reading literature which is effectively 50 years old. And they have read Christopher Clark because they recognise that's there, so they have to allow this for this theme. But it doesn't reflect all the other work that's been run the origins of the First World War. Or think about arguments very specifically in the military context to do with the position of military doctrine and the way in which it can shape international relations. Jack Snyder's ideology of the offensive is still so often the departure point, despite the fact that the work that has been done on this, an important book in his day, Snyder, 1984, despite the fact that the work that has been done on this has been much more varied, much more nuanced, and much more complicated, and actually not terribly helpful to the overall argument. And this is, of course, worrying because, getting to the point of what I want to talk about, this is, of course, worrying because actually, if you're basing theory on bad history, or a history that's outdated, or history that doesn't reflect the current state of what we can get out of the archives, then are you actually constructing a model that works, or are you building a model on insecure foundations? Tarek said, I think it was Tarek, said, of course we all bring theory. No, was it Tarek? It was Tarek, somebody said. But we all bring theory is what we do as history, and that is perfectly true. I entirely accept that. But there is a dialogue here, which is a two-way process. And the function of theory has too often become determinative in what we do. And then there is a third point, and that is, it's of course rubbish to say that history has been entirely dropped from strategic studies since 1905. History is present. Laurie's own history of strategy engages with history. Laurie's own book on strategy engages with history. And that is true of others. Colin Gray absolutely engages with history. Beatrice Heuser engages with history. The challenge here is that what those who are taking the longitudinal study, to use a phrase I used earlier today, doing the longue durée approach to history are doing, is very often they are seeking a degree of continuity in understanding. They're seeking to provide a way of viewing strategy on the basis that there are immediate similarities. I can't resist quoting Colin Gray on this because it seems to me the absolute epitome of what I don't agree with. He says in his book on one strategy, in italics at the beginning, and I've afraid I've quoted this too often, but I can't resist it, there is an essential unity to all strategic experience in all periods of history because nothing vital to the nature and function of war and strategy changes. Well, you know, for military historians, that self-evidently is not true. And if it were true, we'd all be wasting our time sitting and thinking about war and strategy. And there are many examples of this being applied in terms of the use of case studies. And actually, it's become a two-way process. Edward Lookback's 1976, this is 1976, study of the grand strategy of the Roman Empire, when it came out, was derided by Roman historians. They said there's no grand strategy of the Roman Empire, this is a false construction. And in a way, Lookback wasn't making the point. The point when he wrote that book was an argument that was essentially applicable to the United States. He made it very clear in the foreword to the book. This is the United States recovering from the Vietnam War, and what Edward Lookback wrote in his foreword is, we, like the Romans, face the prospect not of decisive conflict, but of a permanent state of war, albeit limited. Above all, the nature of modern weapons requires that we avoid their use while nevertheless striving to exploit their full diplomatic potential. I think it would be strange to most Roman historians to be told, or most Roman historians, that Rome was hesitant to use military force. And hesitant, and of course they're exploiting diplomatic potential, but are they therefore constructing an understanding of strategy that reflects that, just because the United States needs to think back to the mid-1970s? What I find striking now, when I first went to All Souls, lots of classicists there, and I used to say, do you ever read, ever look back on them? And I remember there was one I used to have breakfast with every morning. He said, I'd never heard of the man. He was older than I. If you go down 2 or 3 generations, you talk to Roman historians, there may be 1 or 2 here, they now read every book back, precisely because they take the insights from contemporary strategic studies and put them back into Roman history. Christopher Clark did a very similar thing with the Sleepwalkers. At one level, that book is flawed in my view, because actually he's trying to use international relations theory to make points about 1914, which may actually get in the way of his understanding of the sources. I support the book, speaking of Chris Clark's book, I'm not attacking the book overwhelmingly, but there is a tendency, and of course I'm not saying from this, we shouldn't be trying to make connections between disciplines, self-evidently I'm not, but we need to be very self-aware as we do so. Laurie referred, somebody referred to Graham Allison. Laurie did, and so did Johnny. Referred to Thucydides, the Thucydides trap and the challenge of Thucydides. One of the striking example of this is the love affair between contemporary strategic thought and the history of the Peloponnesian War. I began life as a classicist. I went to Cambridge as a classicist. I had to read Thucydides ad nauseam in Greek, I have to say. I never thought I was reading a book on strategy. It was only much, much later that I was told that I was reading a book on strategy. And what's striking to me, actually, is the early strategic thinkers, I'm talking now 18th, 19th century, the impact of the Enlightenment on military thought, those writers refer back to the ancients, but they don't refer to Thucydides very much. Hans Delbrück seems to be the first serious thinker about war who actually engages directly with Thucydides when he's talking about this idea of the strategy of attrition, and he does, that's the point where Thucydides gets incorporated. Today, all the major US war colleges use Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War as their departure point for understanding strategy. And of course, I see the temptation with the United States identifying itself, no doubt, with Athens rather than Sparta, with a naval power and with a democracy. And it is great that serving officers read Thucydides, even in translation. I'm not saying that's a bad idea. But we need to recognize the limitations of what we can do with this. In 2006, two Greek political scientists, Athanasios Platios and Konstantinos Koliopoulos, produced a book called Thucydides on Strategy, Athenian, Spartan ground strategies and their relevance today, which rested on their belief, and I'm quoting them, that the writings of Thucydides and the ground strategies contained therein are as relevant today as they were in the past, and there is no reason to believe that their relevance shall diminish with time. They quoted Louis Heller to the effect that Thucydides, as he himself anticipated, wrote not only the history of the Peloponnesian War, he wrote the history of the Napoleonic Wars, World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. So there. Why look back when you can look forward? That's what I say. Read Wick Murray, a book not published by CUP this time, or perhaps you are publishing the British edition, is Michael still here? Wick Murray's book on the American Civil War. It's studied through Thucydidean references, describing that author as that greatest of all strategic and military historians. Wick acknowledges that he's being anachronistic. He actually at one point described Thucydides as the Clausewitzian historian, if you really want to get history in reverse. So there is a challenge here, and the challenge is this, that what we're doing with the text like Thucydides is we are divorcing it from its own context. We are not understanding, and this of course is a very historian's point, isn't it? We're not understanding it in the context within which it should be more properly set. One of the benefits of Breakfast in All Souls is I used to discuss these issues with Simon Hornblower, who was normally worrying about the state of his boiled egg and whether it was overboiled or underboiled. But what I would say to him is, Simon, you realize, he's a great Thucydidean scholar for those of you who are any doubt about this. What would I say to you if I told you Thucydides was taught in US Army War Colleges, US War Colleges? You said, I don't believe it. And I said, yes, it's absolutely what happens. And what I cannot understand is what they're getting out of it in terms of understanding the strategy. And he said, well, what of course they're reading is the 1876 Richard Crawley translation, which is the standard one still in every language, which of course reflects the vocabulary of military thought of the late 19th century. So of course, it's easily put into the context. And this absolutely resonates with me because one of the challenges as a schoolboy reading Thucydides was how you could take abstract concepts in Greek, the classical Greek writers tending not to use abstract nouns, but instead tend to use verbs and concrete nouns as a way of expressing ideas. So strategy, as a Greek word, according to Biddle Scott, the great Greek dictionary, does not figure as an abstract noun for the first time in Greek until the 6th century AD, roughly 1,000 years after Thucydides' writing. And we then have a real problem, because of course, if we do think Thucydides is writing about strategy, and Laurie will say I'm splitting hairs, so maybe I am, what he is talking about is of course what today we would indeed call grand strategy. In other words, he's thinking about the use of war in relation to policy. But if you then sit down and read Clausewitz, and he talks about strategy, he quite specifically defines strategy as the use of the battle for the purposes of the war. He sees policy as independent from his understanding of strategy. And he's absolutely consistent with this from his earliest writings in 1804 right through to his death. In other words, he has a much more operationalized view of strategy. So if we have an idea that there is an underlying continuity in how we understand strategy, what we would now see as a dated and overly restricted view of strategy would be that employed by Clausewitz, of all people. Because we would now see strategy as above all about the relationship between war and policy. And arguably, we need to jump right back to Thucydides in order to get a more contemporary, more modern understanding of strategy on the assumption that he is talking about something called grand strategy, even if it's not a label he had himself. Now, let me try and wrap some of this up because I've been talking too long. What am I saying? None of these observations is designed to contradict the case for continuity in how we understand strategy, for continuity itself, or to deny the value of engaging with history the better to understand present predicaments. But continuity, and here Johnny Fennell has stolen some of my thunder, continuity is only half the historian's half, and the easier half. Arthur Marwick has been referred to today, and Arthur Marwick used to, there's always somewhat hazardous presence at conferences, both his love of alcohol, and also, which could be pernicious, and also his desire to talk to, and this is a very unfeminist comment, his desire to pursue every girl in the room. And so I tended to avoid it, but there was one wonderful conference, not that I was one of the beautiful girls in the room, I tend to avoid it with conferences, but there was one conference I was sitting next to him, and a historian whom I shall not name, but a well-known historian of the Holocaust and the German army, started talking about continuities in history. And Arthur got up, full of fury, no doubt lubricated at the time, and said, you simply don't understand. The point about history is to understand change. It's not about continuity. It's very easy, and I'm not abusing Alex, what you were saying just now, it's very easy to link the Holocaust back to the First World War, even if not enough historians do it. And of course there are roots there, but also there's change that enables the Holocaust to take place. And the point that Mark Bloch was making in The Strange Defeat, his account of the defeat in 1940, captures that exactly. If you've not read it, and say Johnny Fennell referred to it, let me urge you to read. Those who are serious scholars of May 1940, the French defeat, tend to poo-poo Bloch's account. That is not the prime reason for reading it now. I mean, Bloch, of course, a great economic historian, a founder of the Annales School, and also a veteran of 2 world wars, and of course executed by the Gestapo in 1944, having fought in the resistance. Bloch, when he wrote The Strange Defeat after the defeat of 1940, wanted to reflect on why the army in which he fought successfully in 1914 had been defeated so quickly in 1940. And in a central section of that book, the middle section of that book, he analyzes that problem. And he talks about what was taught at the École de Guerre in the war period. And he said the real danger was they went back to military history, they used military history, but they saw it as a story of continuity. They went back to Napoleon, and they thought if only we can be like Napoleon again, then all will be all right. And I'm sure he simplified the argument. In fact, I know from having supervised my master's thesis that it's not true. That bataille conduite became very important, did reflect the lessons of the First World War. But the point is, what Bloch then said is that the essence of history is, and I'm quoting him, it teaches us not that what happened yesterday will necessarily happen tomorrow, or that the past will go on repeating itself. By examining how and why yesterday differed from the day before, it can reach conclusions which will enable it to foresee how tomorrow will differ from yesterday. The danger that we have through the stress on theory as we approach strategic studies, for example, is that we stress continuity. We've minimized contingency. The Cold War did this in spades through the development of the deterrence theory. Instead of emphasizing change. Instead of recognizing L.P. Hartley's point and the go-between, as you will remember, the past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. You know, why do historians focus on 1789, or 1917, or 1933, or 1989, or 2001? They focus on them because they're breakpoints, because they're changes. And that is the real challenge. Now, I won't bore with you by talking about operational thought as well, but operational thought does much the same thing. It takes the past to argue for continuity. Maneuver warfare in the 1980s, to take an example that some of you are familiar with, turned back to an invented version of blitzkrieg in order to show a continuity. You know, the only time blitzkrieg was consciously applied, if it was applied at all, was the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, and it conspicuously failed. The invasion of France in 1940 just went according to what happened that day, and indeed Hitler himself did not expect anything more than a limited victory by 1943. Another example would be the use of counterinsurgency doctrine, the development of counterinsurgency doctrine. Mike Watson's just told us the market for those books may be declining, but what is interesting is how successful histories of the campaigns of colonial withdrawal, particularly by part of the British Army, for the last 2 years, have been against the background of Iraq and Afghanistan. That's entirely proper and appropriate in all sorts of ways, but you do need to recognise that the campaigns of colonial withdrawal provide different political contexts from the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. That whatever Field Manual 3-24, the 2006 counterinsurgency doctrine tells you, Algeria is not the same as Iraq or Afghanistan, and that David Galula is not addressing the same set of problems. But the natural tendency with operational thought is to look at presidents in very literalistic ways. Vincent Desforges, who was then head of the French Army Doctrine Centre, coming to Oxford, and Galula then was not yet in French translation, saying we've got to go back, and Mike will be pleased to hear this, to Gallieni, Lyoté, and we need to translate Galula into French, which they duly did, in order to find our roots. Absolutely fine, of course they should, but they need to recognise the difference, what has changed, rather than what has not changed. Let me end just by tying this back to Clausewitz. One of the striking things, and I think with two pictures that Michael has there, this is perhaps highly appropriate to say this. One of the striking things for anybody who works on Clausewitz is the fate, if you like, of the Howard and Perret translation of On War, which in its day, in 1976, reopened Clausewitz and has continued to reopen Clausewitz to a whole raft of new scholars, including German-speaking scholars who find the German so impenetrable in the original edition. It's far easier to read the English version than it is to read the German. But one of the consequences of that, and Michael himself was very open about this, was his determination to make On War understandable to those who served, to make it understandable to a present generation, and to use vocabulary that reflected that as he did so. And in the 1970s, late 1970s, early 1980s, that absolutely resonated. This was Clausewitz for the Cold War. This was Clausewitz for the context of the post-Vietnam generation as far as the United States was concerned. When the Cold War ended, and armies confronted actual operations again, then a raft of critics emerged to say, this doesn't reflect our experience. This no longer works. And there was a point, and all of you are familiar with the principal critics, Mary Caldor, John Keegan, indeed, Martin van Creveld, and others, who said, you shouldn't be reading Clausewitz because it's state-centric, because it's dealing with major war, because it's not addressing the sorts of conflicts that are now confronting us in the shape of irregular warfare and non-state actors. But of course, what they were not doing was dealing with Clausewitz as a historical phenomenon, putting Clausewitz in context, or engaging with Clausewitz's own text in the terms of which he wrote it, or indeed engaging with all the other products of Clausewitz's very fertile mind an extraordinary pen. I mean, all his histories of the wars of his own era, as well as the lectures that he gave on small wars and so on at the Queen's Academy before 1812. By re-engaging with Clausewitz as a historical individual, set against the context of his own experiences, we actually revivify Clausewitz for our own era. He becomes no longer stuck in the context of a Cold War Clausewitz, the ideal hero of democratic America confronting the danger of an existential conflict with the Warsaw Pact with the Soviet Union, and instead a much more variegated individual with a much greater range of options. And of course, crucially, and this is really the point at which I'm to end, and I've already spoken far too long, a much more variegated individual who is concerned with understanding war precisely because the function of reading history, and he used history, read regularly more history than he ever read theory, the function of history was to help to ask questions rather than provide answers, to help to provoke you into thinking further, the better to understand what is going on. And if nothing else is achieved by this conference, I suppose that's exactly what we've been trying to do. To set ourselves fresh questions that are better to understand the phenomenon which we are engaged with, rather than trying to provide simplistic answers to what I hope we all agree is a much more complicated set of questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You will take 15, 20 minutes of questions if we can prevail on people to stay a little bit longer. I'm sure everyone will have a lot of things to ask. So would anyone like to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks very much. Simon's left, so maybe I could be the psychiatrist in the room for a little bit. And this is kind of a comment, so I really sort of wonder if you agree with this, Hugh. I mean, I've sat here today, and thank you, Hugh, for a great talk. Thanks, everyone. I've really enjoyed listening to all the military historians today. You know, but as a sociologist, there's an extremely strange feeling of what's your problem? You know, I've sat through a series of soul searching that you're in crisis and falling apart, and I'm thinking, why don't you come over my side? And then you'll see a discipline that really is falling apart and is in genuine, empirically proven crises. And one of the things I might say, actually, listening to the very interesting talks that we've heard today, is that I think the problem is that, in a certain sense, military history or the history of war has become too successful. That as war has moved out from an primarily interstate paradigm to affect every single aspect of our society and culture, as the Saturday night attacks showed, every historian is getting in on the act. And so instead of a tight group of professional experts that you talked so nicely about this morning, you've got this, there's no status distinction. War has disseminated right across the history of faculty. And what I'd say is, sitting here as your sociological psychiatrist or whatever, is that, I mean, for me, there's a clear role for military history. And Alex Watson said it in his talk, where he said, right, okay, what's the connection between military history and the history of warfare? And that seemed to be the answer. There is a history of warfare and war that extends right across all the domains of history: social history, cultural history, popular, etc., etc. Military history focuses on the armed forces and their association and participation in the history of war/warfare. And this is where I thought, Hugh, thank you for your talk, that the key point seems to be absolutely you have a role in the academy, namely, exactly as Hugh said, that you are uniquely placed to demonstrate to us unhistorical, ignorant social and political scientists the extraordinary complexity of historical reality and historical transformation. And so therefore, what I'd say is, you know, lighten up. You're going to be in business a lot longer than British sociology is in business.
Can I reply to that, Dave?
Please feel free.
I mean, Anthony, I entirely agree with you. I mean, I get very cross with particularly American historians. So we heard about them today and their angst-ridden concerns about the state of military history. Military history is in rude health. There's no doubt about that. And when I think, again, put it in personal terms, when I wanted to be a military historian, there were kings, I think, Laurie will correct me, in those days when Michael had left actually by then. So Wolf Mendel was then head of the department, and Brian Bond and Mike Dockrell, and that was it, I think. That was the department. Barry Paskins, I beg your pardon, absolutely. So that was the department. So it was that department. Oxford had the chair in the history of war, which was sometimes filled and sometimes left unfilled. And indeed, the then incumbent, as Michael is wont to say, was sitting on his chair. But that was it. There were no other posts except at Sandhurst. And I went to teach at Sandhurst. When I decided to leave, Michael Howard said to me, "Why are you leaving? It's the one serious department of war studies in the country. There is nowhere else that's doing it." Now, I mean, very few universities do not have some offering of some sort in relation to war or military history. And we can argue about how it's done, and we can argue about how much it should be supported and all the rest of it. But in part that's because it's customer driven. We've got support. And there is the backing is there. And I entirely accept that other disciplines, when I look round, I mean, and think of some of the areas that are not supported, I was supervised by an economic historian, Clive Bilko, and for my PhD. And then there were 7 or 8 departments of economic history directly funded by the ESRC across British universities. I think I'm right in saying, I mean, LSE must still have a Department of Economic History. Glasgow still has a Department of Economic History, but it's largely staffed by social historians, so they can't do number crunching. But that's about it. It's gone. And it's extraordinary to me. And there are whole areas. I am running a conference for next year on the British Home Front at St Andrews. There are some areas of economic, which is essentially about economic and social mobilisation, finding hardcore economic historians to talk about economic history in relation to Britain, the First World War. They are a dire breed, absolutely. They're just not there. Some honourable exceptions, but it's a real challenge. So I entirely agree. We are, I think we are extraordinarily lucky. Journals being sustained. We haven't talked about the impact of the Journal of Strategic Studies, the revamping of the Journal of Military History from being military affairs. I have a vested interest, obviously, in war and history. But in military history, Journal of Strategic Studies has moved more firmly away from military history than was the case. But that's partly because others are in the space, and war and society. There are journals there doing the job, so publishers are putting their weight behind it. Yeah.
I mean, I think diversity is a question of different angles, but that would be my only comment. That might strengthen, but I mean that's a minor issue compared with the strength that I see.
I think there are issues about which disciplines we engage with, and Anthony, given your background in sociology, sociology being a bad state, and actually the army and society story, which used to be so strong in the 70s, is much less strong than it was then, and actually operational military is moving up the narrative in a way that it wasn't there in the academic context. The challenge of engaging with politics, it's there, but at least there is some engagement. I mean, it happens. I think it's become, in disciplinary terms, more complicated for reasons that I've said. But where is anthropology? Where economics are a problem? Philosophy, not bad, actually, it's pretty much because just war tradition, teaching just war tradition is very strong. Laws of armed conflict tend to be pretty strong. So, it's good news in some areas and less good in others.
Thank you, Hugh, for your talk. I just wanted to press you a little bit on your concept of theory, because in the story that you're telling, you're talking about a very particular kind of theory, which is rational choice, political science, and broadly deductive nomological models that want to test general propositions, for which history can only be a case study. But the Clausewitz's two trinities are also, that is a theoretic apparatus in which to make sense of war, which guides you in times when you don't have all the archival stuff that you might want to have. There are other ways of thinking about how it is that we might understand theory that don't run into the kind of hostility between political science theory and history that marks the history of strategic studies that you're talking about. And as we watch political science become even more that way and move into the land of formal theory, those problems are going to become worse, not. And I think this sort of standpoint to that is not a rejection of theory. There's a whole range of theoretical perspectives on society, politics, and the rest of it that don't fit that model.
Absolutely, Derek, and I'm certainly not rejecting theory. And if I fail to stress that enough, then because of course I was deliberately having a go, so I was exaggerating the point. But I think it works at a number of levels. I mean, first of all, Clausewitz is a classic illustration of how theory and experience are in constant dialogue the whole time. You know, I want to establish a theory, and actually, dare I say, I think one of the challenges in how literary translation is they rather imply that he's doubtful about theory. Actually, he's constantly trying to generalize, constantly trying to theorize. And then he's too good a historian because he comes back and says there are exceptions. You know, if I look at the exceptions. And it's that debate that is actually the essence of what he's doing. So that he, you know, so he's embracing the exception to recognize the moderation of theory, but we'll still say this is generally true, even if it's not universal.
It's the theory that allows them to see the exception.
Absolutely, absolutely. Which is a bit like the argument about continuity and change. You need to understand what is genuinely new in order to understand. You need a sense of history to understand what is genuinely new. The other point I would make, and how I am very interested in the history of military theory. You know, I spend a lot of time thinking about that. And in other words, theory itself, because it guides military practitioners, not absolutely, and it may indeed moderate their behaviour in all sorts of unpredictable ways, because it's important, because it's actually what people write when they come back from experiencing war, because following the Jean-Louis and Clausewitz tradition. Theory self-evidently matters in how we approach war, because people then do try and apply it in practice. You know, nuclear deterrence theory matters because people think about how it can underpin international relations and behaviour. And it doesn't mean people necessarily conform to that set of expectations, but it's very important to understand it. So, absolutely, you know, theory has a place. But, you know, I mean, because I've supervised enough people, when I was allowed to supervise in politics and international relations at Oxford, the funding structures made that impossible by the end, even if somebody's working on war. And obviously supervising at St Andrews, you know, what you see is, in many respects, a pressure to go down, for me, a counterintuitive route, which is to begin with a theory as a universal pattern, and then to choose your case study to prove the point. Rather than to begin with the evidence, what's going on here, and then to see what can we conclude from this that may be deductive and maybe normative, which can then be the basis of the theory. In order then, of course, to qualify some challenges.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I work on kind of the history of British policy in response to civil war, mainly in Russia and Ireland. And I also work as a journalist looking at contemporary issues in Iraq and Yemen mainly. And when I'm talking to policymakers or people who are policy wonks essentially, and they ask me about my academic research, they sometimes get excited and kind of say, oh, well, Russia, that's fascinating. It's a train and assist program in a civil war. I mean, could you discuss the comparison for us? At which point I get very worried because the British government weren't calling Russia a civil war until quite late in 1919. And that's not how they understood it at all. Today we consider civil war to be failing states and most likely in poor countries with bad governance. And at the time, to quote Halford Mackinder, civil war was understood as his line is, it's the ultimate test of party government. It's intimately tied up with civilization. In a sense, we consider civil war most likely in the places where then they didn't think it was possible to have one. Yeah. And so I'm left with this dilemma as well. Do I look at case studies for you which are civil wars in terms of how they were historically discussed, in which case they're very, very different situations? Or do I look at this particular case study, in which case the theory and the way that it's being discussed in the sources at the time is using language and frames of reference that, like empire and imperial policy, which really just don't apply anymore. So how do you, there is an interest there, but how do you engage with that as a historian, do you think? Without butchering your subject.
Well, I have your dilemma exactly. I mean, I think personally, I don't get involved in case studies because I actually think case studies don't work for precisely the reasons that you identified. The context, the vocabulary, the understanding, simply not transferable. But what I think you can do, and it comes back in part to the answer I gave Tara, is that the more you read, the more there are deductions that inform your judgment, which can affect your judgment about civil war today or whatever else you're doing. And that's the point, because quite frankly, what it is, I'm sure you're dealing with much brighter politicians than I deal with, but if you're dealing with, they will go to the takeaway very quickly. And if the takeaway is locked into a case study, then actually they're almost certain to get the wrong end of the stick. Whereas, if what you're producing is a general deduction, I mean, let me give you, this is going to sound facile, I'm afraid, by way of response, but I think how often in the last few years I've been to the US Naval War College, and they're really interested in Britain before 1914 because they think, Britain is us in the Pacific now, we're facing China, and there's an Anglo-German naval arms race going on, only it's now a US-Chinese naval arms race. And I said, well, you need to remember the First World War was not caused by an Anglo-German naval arms race. So actually, this is a good news story for you. It's really quite helpful. At the beginning of 1914, Churchill says, everything looks wonderful, it's all looking rosy, and there are other reasons. And so, what are those other reasons? Well, part of it is perhaps smaller powers have the power, the influence to tweak the tails of larger powers and provoke them into war which they may not otherwise have anticipated. That if the war, actually going back to Alex's point about the two versions, which I entirely recognise of Habsburg history, but if actually you have the Habsburg Empire anxious to provoke a small war in the Balkans without thinking through its full implications, then it can be both a recognition of the Habsburg Empire as a great power, sort of working but recognising a challenge, and at the same time Habsburg, the Conrad line, which is the Habsburg Empire will go to hell in a handcart if you can't do about this. So in a way, what you're giving them is the conclusion that actually you may be able to have a naval arms race which is not provocative of war, which actually does stabilise the situation. I mean, not that you can produce a definite answer to this. There are general points there about how allies behave and how it could lead you into conflict. So I wouldn't dwell too much on the case study and actually come up with the generalization, because they're not going to do the detailed work and you are. And you will recognize much more clearly what is specific to 1918, 1919 in the Russian situation, which they won't have the time or the energy to grasp. I mean, of course you can explain to them, but the takeaway for you, whatever it is about civil war, and a train to assist point, can then, if you need, reverse engineer that. I mean, that would be my view. I mean, Laurie's done much more of this sort of stuff than I have, but that would be my take. And and actually, the real danger in the case study is that what you tend to be asked to do is to provide the case study to buttress the preconceived notion of the politician. We need this in order to provide context. And I don't think, and television does it all the time, we need this in order to show there is president there. And you say, well, actually, it doesn't work that way. It's not how it is. There is another way to do it. But very often, that's not there. But once I think you fall into that pressure, then you're in trouble. If you serve yourself.
Thanks. Alex Watson, thanks to you. That was as ever, really insightful and interesting, and I think if I understood correctly, I like the point about history's answers are questions. That's what brings out. That's what history brings out, and I think that's probably a much more. In fact, I think it's definitely a much more promising way to go than the so-called applied history idea, which worries me a lot in any guise. It's all a bit. We've all become a bit too positive, though, and I especially in the company of military historians, I don't feel good about that. It feels unnatural and odd, and it's much more happy with Mike's moderate success story at the start, whereas now at the end of the day, we've taken down the sociologists. Political scientists are completely out of everything. We've really decided that we do things best if only people will listen. And I just wondered, coming back to actually some of what you were saying earlier in the day, there are also problems and challenges that we face, especially if we think we're caught up with contingency, we're caught up with cultural and social specificity, we're aware that the past is different in really key important ways that make grasping bits of the past as case studies a fake thing to do. But then, of course, that means that actually, in some ways, we're all doing case studies, because to really address contingency, to really address the differences of the past, you have to be an expert of that past. Of course. And, of course, what these things that we've dismissed, sociology, political science, and I'm a bit uneasy about standing up for them, but still, the sort of longue durée sort of thing, the willingness to engage over long periods and seek continuities, which are important, as you've also said, I think is still important. If our ultimate mission statement as historians is to understand how history has changed, then we need that long-term view as well. And I wanted to ask you, what then is the future? How do we improve what we're doing? How do we, if it's theory that we need, how do we bring that in? Are there things from sociology or political science that we can still take to achieve that? What's the way forward? Is that?
Well, I'd like to throw back at Alex a bit to something that actually Anthony prompted in my mind, which I didn't respond to, but it partly addresses your question. And it goes back to Michael Howard again. I mean, when Michael Howard and Peter Brodie and others talked about new military history, what they were anxious to do with it was to stress that military history was part of wider history. The point that essentially, if we were really successful, we wouldn't be having any existential discussions about what we're doing, because actually everybody will be doing military history in some form or another, just because everybody will be doing cultural history, social history, economic history, everything else. And of course, political history is something that's really deep, extraordinarily neglected in many ways. But if we were to do that, I mean, in other words, part of the challenge we have is to engage more fully with history. If I have a worry about, and it goes back to a very Michael Howard point, because Michael was always worried about undergraduate degrees in military history. I mean, he felt that you should be doing history much more broadly. You can't understand it. The whole point is that war is locked in society and armies are drawn to society. Then you don't separate armies out. And it's even more worrying if you do military history from a monoglot position with a heavy bias towards one nation. I mean, is that really an education for undergraduate level? Not really. You need to have a much broader frame of reference. Now, it might be, and this is the point that perhaps you might say about war studies, that of course, you might not be doing history in breadth and width and all the rest of it, or depth and width, but you are doing it in relation to other subjects, and that's how you're getting your breadth and your depth. But I would argue, of course, if we're thinking as historians, you need to begin with history, and I do get worried that we may be producing military historians who actually lack the frame of reference historically to be able to put the work they're doing on whatever subsequently becomes. And I was very conscious of this. One of the consequences of having the changing character war program, if I'm not going to tread on any of those toes, looking quickly and nervously. When we set up the changing character war program, which was specifically interdisciplinary, we were very anxious to recruit as our postdoctoral fellows those who had width in terms of what they could do in disciplinary terms, so they could engage in discussions. So the historians could speak to the philosophers could speak to the lawyers, and so on. And actually we achieved that, so there is nobody here. But the biggest problem lay with the historians, because the historians, particularly for their doctorates, had done a deep dive into something very specific and found it extraordinarily difficult, much more difficult than those of these other disciplines that you identified, who were happy with the generalization, who were much more capable of doing that. And we were having to force historians out of their comfort zone in order to think about how they learned from other disciplines much more. And I was one of them. I mean, that I was having to think about this, and I learned a great deal of the process as part of that program. But it is, so I think there is a real issue here. And the challenge is probably, and this comes back to the point I was making when I was being interviewed at Oxford, going to my anecdotal moment, is that individually we almost certainly can't do it. The days of having the sort of Hans del Broek figure is gone. Nobody now would maintain the serious academic post as he did and aspire to write the history of warfare from the ancient world to the present at the level of depth which he did. Part because, of course, the source space is so much richer now, and the questions we would raise are so many more. The challenge, of course, is to engage with others and other disciplines and retain a sufficient intellectual coherence that you're then also engaging in a discussion that carries depth rather than superficiality. And I think that is a much more profound and difficult problem for us. I haven't got solutions to this question, as ever, probably more stimulating and easier, particularly for academics to answer. But I do think it is probably about team activity. And historians, most other disciplines in universities have accepted that what they do is a team activity. Historians have found that inherently much more difficult to do. They tend to be, we all like, we like our own company, and of course, we like other historians too. But I mean, we like our own company individually. And of course, scholarly activity, working in an archive and doing monthly references is essentially a solitary activity. Your engagement, your dialogue with those archives is what drives you onwards and stimulates you, prompts the fresh thoughts, and you bring your interpretive tools, as somebody, a point I think Tarek absolutely made in relation to the archive. But where do you position that? How do you position that? And the answer might be engaging with a secondary source. I mean, let me promote Tarek's book as it comes out. You told me it comes out this week, because Tarek's book absolutely does that about a specific case that depends on the wider literature to make its arguments. I mean, you're engaging with the wider literature. It's studying England army in the Second World War, so to that extent it's absolutely archivally based. But the questions it's asking about why does an army fight and how does it fight, in what context, and what motivates it, and what defines it, actually depends on a whole raft of secondary literature to have that discussion.
Loath, I could tell, is a very interesting discussion, but in the interest of time, please join me in thanking you.
A quick few thank yous, and then we can move on. Are we glass half full or glass half empty? I'm inclined towards glass half full. I think there's a lot of positive stuff. So come back to the very start, incremental gains, little steps forward, and I think that's how you move on a discipline or a sub-discipline. Can I thank David, without whose hard work he did the major lifting on all the organisation for this conference. Danny, who you probably saw earlier on, who looked after the coffee, etc. All our presenters, our attendees, and the Faculty of Social Science and Public Policy for fronting up the money. I hope that you're going to hear more from Sir Michael Howard, and you're going to hear more from us in terms of these kind of events. The next one that we're organising is a conference at the end of June, when East meets West, the Second World War in global perspective. And I think some of you here are coming, and if you're not already down, look into it. It'll be a super day. If you're keen on dinner, hang around. I think we're going to go to a local eatery in the next few minutes. Thank you very much.